Crimea Ukrainian or Russian? Since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, this question keeps coming up, and the policy of the United States is not to recognize this annexation. In fact, the US imposed sanctions against Russia because of it. I was Treasury spokesperson, I handled that announcement. But this idea of possibly recognizing Crimea as part of Russia has popped up a few times with the Trump administration, so let's get to the bottom of it. I love when I can geek out. Crimea was originally part of Russia and remained that way until 1954. On February 19 of that year, which was during the Soviet Union, the leader at the time, who was a guy named Nikita Khrushchev, gifted Crimea to Ukraine. He did this to commemorate the 300th anniversary of a treaty called the Treaty of Pereyaslav, which was a treaty signed in 1654 that aligned Ukraine with Russia. Now, because Ukraine and Russia were both republics under the Soviet Union at the time, it was viewed as a symbolic gesture by the Soviet leadership since it didn't have an impact on broader national borders. But internal borders changed. Crimea was formally transferred to the Republic of Ukraine, and it was recorded in official Soviet documents, and Soviet maps reflected that change. When the Soviet Union then collapsed in 1991, Crimea became part of independent Ukraine. Now, it's worth noting that the population of Crimea remained mixed with ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians, and that it did have autonomy within Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union, but that autonomy kept dwindling under the Ukrainian parliament. Now, to fast forward a little bit, in 2014, a pro-Western revolution in Ukraine ousted the pro-Russian president at the time named President Yanukovych. Shortly after that, Russia invaded and annexed Crimea. They held a highly disputed referendum under military occupation and claimed that 97% of Crimean voters wanted to join Russia. Nobody believes that number for obvious reasons.
Actually, it was 367% of voters and 146% voted.
However, polling on this topic in the years before 2014 was mixed, with some centers finding that a low majority of Crimeans approved the idea of joining Russia, and other polls finding that the majority wanted to remain with Ukraine, especially if Crimea was given greater autonomy. Now, the annexation violated Ukraine's sovereignty, as well as past agreements it had with Russia, where Russia promised to never invade Ukraine. But when it comes to the question of other countries internationally recognizing Russia's annexation, technically under international law, UN members are not allowed to do that. The UN was established after World War II in part to prevent warmongers like Putin from lopping off a piece of their neighbor's land. And so Article 2.4 of the UN Charter explicitly states that territorial acquisition by force is illegal. Now, Russia is clearly in violation of the UN Charter, and yet it remains on the UN Security Council. So I'm not trying to pretend that this system is perfect at preventing this kind of behavior. That's another world of dysfunction we can talk about in a separate video. But if countries were to recognize Crimea as Russian, it would crumble that entire system. So not only would Russia get away with this, but it would open up the floodgates for other countries and leaders to do the same thing. So the answer to this question is that whether or not Putin is pissed that Khrushchev gifted Crimea to Ukraine, and whether he believes he's righting some kind of wrong from the past, is not his place to say. The land was originally Russian, it was officially transferred to Ukraine by Russia, making it Ukrainian.